Hello, my name is Luis Alvarez, and today I'm going to talk about a PowerPoint that has historical and theoretical and it has the policy foundations of ESL in education. So, kind of go over a little timeline throughout the years up until now and how the laws and how the Civil Rights Act movement of 1954 um, inspired other laws and inspired other acts and inspired Congress to make changes. So, first started in 1954. Now, this year, um, the Brown versus Board of Education happened, and the Supreme Court outlaws separate but equal public schools, which means, now the schools are going to be integrated. It's not going to be an all white or an all black school, or it's not going to keep the Chinese or the Asian or the Hispanic or Mexican people out of school. So now they're all integrated. And so now the school is going to have to deal with white English speakers that are fluent. They'll have to deal with Africans whose dialect is a little bit different. They'll have to deal with Asian that may not know any English at all, or Mexicans that only speak Spanish. So this is a big deal now because all these students are now able to be into one school, which is going to affect the teaching. It's going to affect instruction. It's going to affect pretty much everything that has to do with public schools. So in 1964, like I mentioned earlier, the Civil Rights Act passes Congress, and it prohibits race, sex, and national origin discrimination in government-funded programs. So confusion has kind of arisen from two approaches that has characterized the federal government's role. So, on the other hand, it has provided financial aid to support programs for people who need to learn English, but it has taken steps to also ensure that these children have an equal chance to succeed. So, policy on both approaches have enhanced, or they have made the educational opportunity, but they not always have ran side by side. So now in 1965, as part of the war on poverty, Congress passes the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Now this act it's important because it addresses the academic needs of poor children. You know, then in 1966, 37 bilingual education bills are introduced to Congress. Now, I haven't compared it to other years, but 37 in one year seems like a lot of bills for Congress to have to go through, and some they pass and some they don't. So I'm not too sure what are some of the bills that they did not pass, but it'd be interesting to research that and see which ones they did not, and it may have affected what happened. So the next year, in 1968, the Bilingual Education Act becomes law, which at that time President Johnson signed the Bilingual Education Act and put it into law. So this was important because it was the first signal that U.S. government was committed to assisting students with limited English skills. So now showing that the government does care and that it is a topic that they're talking about, and it's important to them that the president actually signed the bill and put it into law. So now in the next year, or the next 2 years, in 1970, the Office for Civil Rights issues a memorandum for school districts to obligation to take affirmative steps to overcome language barriers for students. Now, also in 1970, Liu versus Nichols lawsuit was filed. Now, this was happened in San Francisco, and the schools were neglecting the needs of Chinese background students. So, so that happened in 1970, but in 1974, a lot of things were changed due to that case, Liu versus Nichols. Now, unanimously, the Supreme Court decision, it outlawed the sink or swim instruction, and it was making a mockery of equal education. So, that was a major court decision on the right of language minority students. And it was the only ruling by a Supreme Court case. It all started because of a poverty lawyer named Steinman. He learned that his client's child was failing in school because he couldn't understand language. So, he didn't think it was fair. So what he did was, he filed a lawsuit on behalf of Kenny Liu and many other Chinese background parents had students. So he also added them into the lawsuit. So it was more than just one. It was a lot of Chinese or a lot of Asian people that were having problems. So he alleged that they were being denied education on equal terms, but the teachers were saying, unlike Brown versus Board of Education, there's no discrimination, there's no segregation, there's no desperate treatment. So um, the teachers pretty much came to a conclusion that all students were getting the same instruction without regard to the national origin. So so they felt like if the Chinese children had language problem, that was unfortunate, but that's not the district's problem, or it's not the district to blame. So, like I mentioned, in 1974, the Supreme Court overruled the lower courts and said that there's no equality of treatment there. The judge said that just merely providing students with the same facilities or the same textbooks or the teacher ratio to students, it who don't understand English are, they're just being kept out of meaningful education. So, when they passed this law, there was no constitutional guarantees at first. So the decision stopped short of making bilingual education so that the districts can pursue different or alternative methods. So they didn't mandate them or give them specifically what to do. That way the districts can, use an alternative method or, whatever they felt they needed to do. So at that time, the court decision on Liu versus Nichols, it drew little attention to the public. The public really didn't notice at that time what was going on. So a little bit after that, ASPIRA consents mandates bilingual instruction for Latino children in New York City. So I think they're the first city that, they mandate that bilingual instruction. So they were the first one to step forward. So in New York, which had a lot of Latino children, needed that help. So, eventually in 1974, they also passed the Bilingual Education Act, which, it was reauthorized. So professional development stressed, use of students' native language and culture was now required in the funded programs, which was really important for the students that were needing help. So now the court made it law, and so now they're going to have to help those students. Now, so few years later, 1978, the AIR returns a mediocre report card for Title IV, highlights program efforts to maintain Spanish. Now, the Bilingual Education Act, it reauthorized already. The language maintenance was banned, funding restricted to transitional programs. In Regents of University of California versus Bake, the Supreme Court limits civil rights claims to sales in which intentional discrimination can be proved, which is weakening legal basis of Liu versus Nichols. So those laws, now in 1978, the Supreme Court limits those rights. Then it claims that there's no intentional discrimination can be proved, so it kind of made it harder for the steps that Liu versus Nichols were making, kind of put them 2 steps backwards and then 2 steps forward. So this was the part where it took 2 steps backwards, and then, in 1981, it takes some steps forward, because due to those Liu regulations, they're withdrawn by the incoming Reagan administration. They called it harsh, inflexible, burdensome, unworkable, and incredibly costly. So when DeLue versus Nichols was making sure the funding was going to these programs and they had to help bilingual students. Now Reagan's saying that no, that's not how it works. So, and also in 1981, the next thing is Virginia legislature designates English as state's official language. So now local districts are shielded from mandates for bilingual education. So the U.S. Department of Education leaks Baker versus Cantor report questioning the effectiveness of transitional bilingual education. So then the federal appeals courts, in a case that's for Castaneda versus Pickard, says three-prong test for schools districts, meaning obligations to English learners. So 1981 had a few things in it. Now, in 1982, federal court orders U.S. versus Texas requiring bilingual education statewide in grades K through 12 is overturned on appeal. Then in 1994, the Bilingual Education Act is reauthorized again. Modest funding allowed for developmental, bilingual, and special alternative programs. So it was a long road, but it all started with the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which first started the ball rolling, and now today bilingual education is just one of the norms. It's expected to be included in your instruction, expected to be included in your teachings, because now the schools are so diverse. You're not going to be a good teacher if you're not able to help all your students equally.